Nepo goes for 1 e4 and Magnus responds with the Scandinavian. What a risky opening to play against a top player. Magnus develops his queen early in the opening. Isn't this what you were told not to do when you start out chess? But Magnus says, I'm the world champion. I can play the way I like. Also, Scandinavian is quite a fine opening. But white always gets a small opening advantage, and there you can see Nepo developing all his pieces. His knights have come out. The bishop is also on c4 and e3, while Magnus is still lagging behind in development. e6 has been played, and now Nepo goes for h3, and also he can go g4 now, pushing the bishop away, gaining more space. That's exactly what he does, and he plays his queen to e2. The idea is he wants to castle long. That would mean his rook would be already in the game. The other rook can jump to e1. Wow, Magnus has some serious thinking to do here, but he just develops his bishop on e7. Now Nepo sacrifices a pawn with knight to e5. You can see that the knight can be taken, pawn can be taken, and queen e5. Here, the rook just falls down, but Magnus places it back. And queen comes back to c7. So a very logical decision by Nepo to give up a pawn in order to exploit his lead in development. But can he do it? Or does Magnus have everything under control? Now Nepo brings his rook to f1. Maybe he's trying for f5 pawn push, but before that Magnus pushes his pawn to b5. Now bishop to b3 and b4, attacking the knight. Magnus trying to push the pieces away. Also, he's getting the e4 square for his pieces. So short castle. He sees that f5 can be taken and the bishop can pop out on h5. So therefore, Nepo pushes his pawn to h4. Now Magnus can respond with h5, but instead he puts his bishop on e4. Bishop c5 or knight c5 here would be a very nice move for white. But Nepo goes g5. The problem is now the f5 square is weakened. And you will see that now Magnus can put his bishop there on f5, which will be a great outpost for the bishop. It cannot be disturbed from there. But Nepo is like, I'm coming at your king. I'm going to push h6 as well. Maybe g6 in some positions. Also Magnus going low on time. He pins the pawn on f4. Queen e3 attacks the knight. Now what is to be done next? And Magnus chops off another pawn. The king moves to b1. Is this all? Some kind of an issue? He goes rook d8. What quick thinking by Magnus Carlsen. You can see that bishop e5 is possible here and Nepo does it, but Magnus is going to make an in-between move here. He's going to pick up the rook on d1 so that his f4 knight would not be hanging. But, oh, it's hanging. Now bishop takes, queen is a threat. Also the knight on f4 is hanging. How do we save everything? How does the world champion get out of it? And he's trying to move the knight. Wow, what a move. You can see that Nepo is surprised here because now the knight attacks the queen. The bishop attacks the queen. And also if you took queen takes g5, the e5 piece was hanging. So Nepo plays his queen to d4. Magnus brings his queen to e7. But isn't the g7 pawn hanging here? Yes, it is. But Magnus does not care. He's like, let's bring the rook to d8. Wow, what a game by Magnus. h6 trying to save the bishop here. But Magnus now can win the queen. He can give a check with his knight. Pawn takes and now pick up the queen. Rook takes. This is not sufficient compensation. Magnus brings his bishop here and Nepo knows that nothing worked for him. He's smiling still after the game. That's all because they are good friends of each other. But Magnus Carlsen showed some brilliant defensive skills in the game. What a match this was between two fantastic chess players, and Magnus comes back and changes the result there. He's like, oh, I won there in that game, not Nepo.